Welcome to Who's Point. I'm Alan Hu, and I would like to share with you all events that has been occurring in Hong Kong and also the international community's response to events in Hong Kong that has stirred a lot of controversy and results in actions like sanctions against Hong Kong and mainland government officials dealing with Hong Kong. Recently, there's been a disqualification of 4 legislators by the SAR government. And the British government, on the very next day, responded very quickly in sync with the American government's response that this is all a breach of the Sino-British Joint Declaration, and that these actions disqualifying legislators from Hong Kong for breaching their parliamentary oaths are a flagrant breach of a treaty entered between Britain and China in 1984. The British government's condemnation of the actions of the Hong Kong government has not been a really considered and fair procedural approach. There's been no getting the facts on the ground, talking to the Secretary of Justice in Hong Kong as to the legal basis for the disqualification, speaking to academics in Hong Kong, community leaders in Hong Kong as to the wheres and whys and how does this work within the basic law in Hong Kong. After all, we're not talking about the Joint Declaration here. That's a historic document in 1984. And if you start even there, I mean, in 1984, what was it that the British government asked or insisted the Chinese government do in this treaty, the so-called treaty, the Joint Declaration? In 1984, all of the legislators in Hong Kong were appointed by the governor to serve at Her Majesty's pleasure, and by the same token, to be dismissed at Her Majesty's displeasure. So, what sort of device was in place? I mean, the argument, as I understand it, is they look not at the Joint Declaration, but at Article 79 of the Basic Law, which they could not and will not and should not refer to because it's Hong Kong's constitution. You don't interfere in another place's constitution. You may go and argue over some treaty that you are a party to and say you're not complying with it. But Article 79 of the Basic Law is under a section that deals with basically the affairs of the Legislative Council, right? The section preceding it deals with the chief executive and the executive branch, and the section after it deals with the judiciary. So it's dealing with the Legislative Council, which says that the chairman of the Legislative Council can, in certain circumstances, disqualify members for not complying with their oath in the performing of their legislative functions, but he must have a 2/3 majority support. They must be endorsed by the 2/3 majority of all the Legislative Council members. Now, as I understand it, that is the basis of the British government's argument, although I've never heard it actually articulated clearly. But this is the argument that, there you are, not in the Joint Declaration, but in the Basic Law, which I'm not referring to, but it says 2/3 majority. And you're now just doing it not in accordance with that. And the executive branch of the Hong Kong government is disqualifying them for reasons which had not really been considered properly by the British government. Are they saying that you can't disqualify people and this is not just legislators, applies to all branches of government. Article 104 of the Basic Law says all government servants, be they in the executive branch, the legislative branch, or the judicial branch, must swear an oath of allegiance to the sovereignty of the Chinese government over Hong Kong and to the functioning of the local government in accordance with the Chinese constitution and the basic law. Now, what's wrong with that? That's the same requirement for all legislators in the world. I mean, take the case in point in Hong Kong. The complaint is that these legislators complained about the Hong Kong government, the way they are administering Hong Kong, whatever the nature of the complaint, but that's the complaint, and also against the Central People's Government. And they say they're being repressed. And they want to have, let's say, a change of regime, or what was the expression, the overthrow of regime, the revolution of our times, and all that. But with physical and sometimes violence and massive criminal damage to Hong Kong society. And instead of protesting, instead of taking the issue up with Hong Kong government officials, right, central government officials, they went to America, to another country, which has never been known to show any particular interest or concern for Hong Kong and the welfare of its inhabitants, to go there to their Congress officially and complains about this, asking for sanctions against Hong Kong government officials, asking for action from another government against the Hong Kong government and the central government. Now, let's just take this situation in reverse. Let's say a few congressmen of the California State Congress, and not the federal Senate or Congress, but the state Congress, very unhappy about how their federal government is dealing with black people's benefit and lives, black people's welfare. They're very unhappy about that. They're saying that their rights have been trampled on, that police have been acting excessively against black people, and also that peaceful protests all over California has been, suppressed by the federal government, either through working with the police or calling out or trying to call the National Guard. And let's take that example that these two California congressmen have that grievance. But instead of taking it up with the state legislature at Sacramento, with the American people, or going to Washington, D.C., let's say instead they do what the Hong Kong district legislators did, Hong Kong legislators did. They go to China when we're having our National People's Congress, when it's in session, and complains to the NPC representatives, some of them may be members of the Chinese Communist Party, and complain that there has been this suppression of people's rights, civil rights in America, and want China to do something and sanction American government officials, sanction the Secretary for Homeland Security, sanction the Secretary for State. What do you think will happen when these congressmen go back to the United States?